Alyssa Rowan woke at 5:02 to sharp knocks on the door, a sound that clashed with the neighborhood's usual calm and her methodical way of starting the day. She sat up with the weary lucidity of those who have learned to sleep on edge since a recent loss, and remembered the digital clock blinking due to a power outage a few days earlier. The house she had inherited from her grandmother smelled of wood and stale coffee, and the hallway carpet had a wax stain she always mindlessly avoided. She barely opened the peephole and saw Gabriel Stone, the quiet neighbor next door, breathing heavily and wearing an expression she had never seen on him before. He said few words, just enough to shatter any routine. That she shouldn't go to work, that she should trust him. She didn't wait for a reply. The doorway swallowed her silhouette, leaving only the cold early morning air. Alyssa wasn't one to believe in warnings, but the way he'd looked down the hallway, almost counting it, left her frozen, her hand on the doorknob. She double-locked it again and rested her forehead against the wood, checking her pulse as if she needed one more piece of information to make a decision. The house fell silent once more, and that kind of silence always felt like an incomplete equation. She didn't dress in her usual gray suit, or prepare the thermos she took to the car. She stayed in the kitchen, measuring everything, as if the morning were a spreadsheet that had to balance. At 6:10, she sent a brief email to the team saying she would be late, carefully choosing her tone so as not to arouse suspicion or unnecessary curiosity. She thought about her father, about the last afternoon when she tried to tell him, "There's something you don't know," and how his cough stole the words from him. That interruption had stuck in her mind like an unclosed parenthesis. The neighborhood awoke in stages, a blind being raised, a motor starting, a dog barking, and then falling silent at the first shout. Alyssa left her phone on silent, face down, and opened the notebook where she jotted down small things. Times, license plates she saw repeated, calls from unknown numbers. At 7:32, she noted that a blue sedan had passed by her house again, slower than usual, and didn't hesitate to write it down. The numbers calmed her. She made herself a weak, cold coffee, the kind you make when your mind is elsewhere, and left it on the counter without tasting it. She didn't have a clear explanation, just a practical feeling. Heed the warning, and if nothing happened, accept it as just another oddity in a week that had gone wrong. The wall clock struck 8:02, and without knowing why, that minute seemed longer than the rest of the hour. At 12:17, the landline rang, a sound she hadn't heard in months because she managed everything from her cell phone. She answered cautiously, expecting to hear the voice of a call center operator, but on the other end there was an administrative silence, followed by a question that made her heart sink. "Can we confirm that you are safe, Miss Rowan?" The voice belonged to a police officer who mentioned her name, his office, and his patrol car number, as if reading from a report. Alyssa awkwardly replied that yes, she was home, but the line filled with static, and before it cut out, she managed to hear, "You were seen entering the building at 8:02. That sentence didn't fit with anything, except for the clock that had kept her frozen in front of the window. She stared at her reflection in the glass, trying to reason with the impossibility. Someone had used her routine, her identity, her shadow. Her body trembled without her realizing it. It wasn't fear yet. It was mathematical bewilderment, the kind of error that shouldn't exist. She opened her laptop, searched the news, and found what was missing. Her company's building appeared on the screen, surrounded by police cars, with a headline that read, "Attack leaves several injured, suspect missing." Her own name completed the sentence. Alyssa's brain tried to process everything like an audit report. Facts, times, witnesses. But nothing added up. The car the police described was in her garage. The crack was in her purse. She tried calling her boss, but the number was disconnected. She tried dialing Gabriel, and there was no answer either. She went to the window and saw a gray car parked in front of her door, tinted windows and the engine running, smoke billowing out as if someone were waiting for orders. For the first time in years, she felt that the data was useless. Her father had been the last to warn her that the truth isn't always in the numbers, and only then did she understand what he meant. Alyssa closed the curtains, unplugged the router, and sat on the floor with her back against the wall, trying to understand how someone could have planned her disappearance without her noticing. The house was filled with that metallic smell of fear mixed with dust, and in the midst of that silence she felt with certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The sound of footsteps on the gravel in the garden made her gasp. Someone was approaching the side of the house, slowly, as if they knew the area. She picked up her phone, but the screen still showed no signal. A shadow crossed the curtain, and her fear took on a simple logic. If they were looking for her, it was because someone needed her to remain silent. She went to the back door, where her father's jacket still hung, the one she hadn't dared to wash since the funeral. She put her most important documents inside: her passport, a set of keys without identification, and an old envelope with her father's handwriting. She didn't know where to go, but she knew that staying would be surrendering. The gray car started abruptly and drove off without its lights on, leaving an echo that lingered. Alyssa seized that moment and slipped out the side door, feeling as though every step was a file she had to protect. She walked down the deserted street, her hands cold and her mind on autopilot, as if someone else were guiding her. She remembered a 24-hour cafe near the canal and headed there. She needed light, noise, witnesses. The bar smelled of grease and cigarettes, and an old television was showing the local news. On the screen, again, her photo. Alyssa Rowan, financial analyst, wanted for possible connection to the bombing. She felt her stomach drop, her entire life, organized in folders, disintegrating in seconds. She ordered tea just to justify her presence and tried to stay calm while checking the headlines on the phone the waiter had lent her. Social media was already reporting her dead, and some were saying her car had exploded in front of the building. Alyssa closed the browser. Her fear wasn't just of dying, but of ceasing to exist in the correct version of her own story. And at that point, what hurt the most was not the danger, but the certainty that no one would know the truth. Gabriel appeared at 1:05 p.m., wearing the same dark coat as in the early morning, his gaze more alert than ever. He didn't ask anything. He simply sat down across from her, placing a folded envelope in a small metallic device that looked like a blank card on the table. Alyssa felt a mixture of relief and suspicion. He wasn't behaving like an ordinary neighbor, but like someone accustomed to planning his every move with precision. Before she could speak, he said in a low voice, "Don't trust anyone. Those who are after you aren't looking to protect you." He told her to stand up, not to look back, and paid the bill with exact bills, leaving no tip. They left through a side door and walked toward an alley where a black SUV was waiting with its engine running. The air smelled of rain and gasoline, and Alyssa felt her life peeling away from reality like a damp leaf from an old wall. She got into the vehicle with the feeling of signing a contract whose terms she didn't remember. Reading. During the drive, Gabriel spoke only when absolutely necessary. The sound of the windshield wipers was the only constant, as if that movement were marking the rhythm of their escape. Alyssa tried to maintain mental control by listing things: the names of her colleagues, the passwords she remembered, the addresses that might still be safe. But each thought dissolved into the next, replaced by a bigger question: who was this man who seemed to know everything? Gabriel finally said that he had promised to protect her, that her father had contacted him weeks before he died. That was enough to make her tremble, because her father had never been the type to ask for favors. Gabriel's gaze hardened when he mentioned "they," a pronoun that sounded more dangerous than any specific name. The car turned onto a forest road with no signs or lights. Alyssa tightened her seatbelt and, for the first time, allowed herself to believe that she was escaping something bigger than an administrative error. The road narrowed and became muddy, surrounded by trees so tall they blocked the sky. Gabriel drove without hesitation, as if he knew every curve, and Alyssa understood that this route wasn't improvised. Halfway there, he stopped the car and asked her to get out. They walked through bushes until they reached an old, half-buried concrete structure. There were no doors in sight, only a rusty metal gate. Gabriel pressed the device he had left on the coffee table, and a short beep activated eyes. The mechanism. The air filled with dust and the smell of old metal. Alyssa followed him down a narrow, damp staircase. Inside, a dim light illuminated a table with folders labeled with her last name. Some had dates she recognized: her birth date, her mother's death date, her father's last medical checkup. It was as if her entire life had been observed from another angle, one she had never consented to. Gabriel handed her a sealed letter and told her it was the only thing her father had managed to smuggle out before he died. Alyssa opened it with trembling hands. The paper was yellowed and smelled musty. Her father apologized for his silence and confessed that her birth had been part of a secret program called the Rowan Initiative. She read those words several times without fully understanding them. It said she possessed a rare genetic variation, something that made her resistant to diseases and chemical agents, and that the government had tried to replicate her DNA for decades. Alyssa thought it was impossible, that there must be a mistake, but the dates matched the medical reports she remembered signing. Her father begged her not to trust anyone and to find the chest he had hidden. Gabriel watched silently without interrupting, as if he already knew what the letter said. Alyssa's fear was no longer abstract. Now it had a name and a purpose. Alyssa asked what it all meant, but Gabriel didn't answer right away. He just walked over to the side panel and turned on an old screen that displayed a map with coordinates and access logs. He explained that her father had worked on a covert bioengineering project, disguised as an accounting audit within a private company. The program's goal was to identify spontaneous genetic mutations and, if possible, replicate them. When he discovered they were using innocent people as test subjects, he tried to report it, but it was too late. They threatened him, silenced him, and finally faked his death as a common heart attack. Gabriel, who had served in intelligence operations, was assigned to protect the only person who could destroy the project, her. Alyssa listened, her gaze unfocused, trying to absorb the gravity of what she was hearing. In that moment, she felt that her entire life had been a carefully orchestrated lie. The air inside the bunker was heavy, as if each word added a layer of contaminated oxygen. Gabriel showed her a briefcase containing hard drives, photographs, and classified documents with federal seals. There were files with her name and a biometric identification number she didn't recall ever having. One of the reports, dated from her childhood, described evidence of chemical exposure at a rural hospital where she had undergone minor surgery. Alyssa remembered the episode: a fall, prolonged anesthesia, a nurse watching her with undue interest. Everything she had considered mere chance now took on a new meaning. Her hands trembled as she realized that her immunity wasn't a genetic blessing but a curse inherited from covert experiments. Gabriel closed the briefcase and told her they had to leave before the system detected any activity. Alyssa nodded wordlessly, her eyes glazed, certain that the truth had finally caught up with her. When they climbed back outside, the afternoon had fallen into a grayish hue that made it seem as if time itself was watching them. The silence of the forest was so dense that any crack of a branch sounded like an alarm. Gabriel scanned the perimeter with a small scanner, while Alyssa packed the letter and briefcase into a backpack. Her breathing was still ragged, not so much from fear but from the magnitude of what she now knew. Suddenly, a metallic whir cut through the air, like a drone flying overhead. Gabriel turned off the scanner, took her arm, and pulled her into the thicket. They moved forward, crouched low, through damp roots and dry leaves that clung to their shoes. Each step was a decision between moving forward or stopping forever. When they finally reached the vehicle, Gabriel said without looking at her, "They found us sooner than expected." Alyssa didn't reply, but something inside her ignited, an impulse to never run again. The engine roared with an uneven sound, as if the vehicle, too, felt the weight of the pursuit. Alyssa stared out the window at the distant lights moving among the trees, knowing they weren't fireflies. Gabriel handed her a small storage device and told her that if anything happened to him, she should activate the contents and follow the coordinates written on the back. She carefully put it away, making no promises. The road wound its way through endless curves and a fine rain, the kind that soaks you without a sound. In the back seat, the briefcase vibrated with every bump, as if the past itself were demanding to be released. Alyssa leaned her head against the window and felt a knot in her stomach. She no longer knew if she was running away or moving toward the truth. The landscape was a blur, but her thoughts were clear. She couldn't continue living under a fabricated identity, and although she didn't know how, she understood that at some point she would have to confront those who had written her destiny. They arrived at a cabin hidden among pine trees, almost invisible from the road. The roof was covered in moss and the windows were boarded up. It looked abandoned, but inside everything was clean, as if someone had been keeping it ready for this moment. Gabriel lit an oil lamp and scanned the interior with precise movements. Alyssa placed her backpack on the table and looked around. An old radio, a folded military bed, and a black and white photograph of a group of men in uniforms without insignia. She recognized one of the faces, her father, younger, barely smiling. Her throat tightened. That image shattered any doubts she had been told. Her father wasn't just an accountant, but someone who had participated in something that could never appear in public records. She sat down, and for the first time that day felt the urge to cry, but not a single tear came. It was as if her body had decided to conserve all emotion in order to survive. Gabriel spoke little that night. He explained that the place had its own generator, and that tracking signals didn't reach it. Alyssa tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she heard her father's voice repeating, "Don't trust them." Outside, the wind whipped through the branches, and the roof creaked as if it were breathing. She got up and peered through the crack in the window. Nothing but darkness and rain. On the floor beside the bed, she found a metal box bearing the same logo as the program, Rowan Initiative. Inside was a small glass vial containing a clear liquid and a label that read, Subject EO1. Alyssa held it for a moment, watching the liquid tremble with each heartbeat of her hand. That vial was the tangible proof of everything her father had tried to destroy, and now she understood that she would carry that legacy, even though she hadn't asked for it. As dawn began to filter through the cracks in the roof, Alyssa was already dressed, her backpack slung over her shoulder, her father's letter folded inside her jacket. Gabriel was reviewing the map in a notebook, tracing lines with a short, worn pencil. He said there was a point marked 3 kilometers away, an entrance to an underground bunker built by Alyssa's own father. She didn't ask questions. The silence between them had become functional. They didn't need explanations, just movement. The path was muddy and covered in wet leaves, and each step made a sound that blended with the murmur of the rain. At times, Alyssa thought they wouldn't make it, that the drones would reappear, but they didn't. Only the forest, the cold, and the constant echo of their breathing accompanied them. When they reached a lichen-covered rock, Gabriel pointed to a hidden hatch in the ground. The entrance to the family treasure chest was there, waiting for them like an open wound. Before we continue, let me pause briefly. If you've made it this far, you're probably just as surprised as many were when they first heard Alyssa's story. Tell me where you're watching from and if you've ever had that feeling of someone watching your every move. Your input helps more people discover stories like this, as tales that were nearly silenced continue to come to light. Now, let's continue. Alyssa crouched beside the hatch and noticed it had a dusty fingerprint reader, the same kind of technology her father had mentioned in old reports. Gabriel wiped the surface with the back of his sleeve and nodded. She placed her hand on the panel, and a small metallic click broke the silence of the forest. The ground vibrated slightly, and the hatch swung open to the side, revealing a metal staircase descending into darkness. Cold, stagnant air wafted from inside, mingled with the smell of rust. Gabriel went down first, illuminating the path with a small flashlight, while Alyssa followed, clutching her backpack tightly. The descent was long and narrow, the concrete walls stained with damp and old technical symbols painted in red. At the bottom, they found a double door with a dusty digital seal. Alyssa scanned the device Gabriel had given her, and the system emitted a sharp beep before unlocking. Inside, the place seemed frozen in time. Desks with open folders, blank screens, and a generator still running with a faint hum. On a table lay a black notebook with the name Rowan embossed in gold lettering. Alyssa's heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. He knew that inside was what his father had wanted to protect, and what others had killed to hide. She opened the notebook carefully, as if handling a relic. The first few pages were filled with formulas, DNA graphs, and diagrams of cell structures. Then came personal notes, names of employees, locations, and dates of clinical trials. Every line confirmed that her father had worked within the program as an undercover agent, gathering evidence to expose him. On one of the last pages, there was an instruction written in blue ink. If you read this, you will already know who you are. Activate the disclosure protocol. Alyssa looked up and saw a control terminal at the back of the lab with a lit screen, waiting for a command. Gabriel watched her silently, as if he too understood the weight of this decision. She walked to the console, running her fingers over the dusty panel. The monitor displayed two options: Acquisition Protocol and Revelation Protocol. The fate of her entire life lay within those two words. Alyssa took a deep breath and thought about everything she had lost. Her job, her name, her freedom, even the innocent version of her own past. The button she chose would determine not only her future, but also the future of everyone who had ever been unknowingly used. Gabriel told her that if she activated the Revelation Protocol, there would be no turning back. The system would leak every classified file to international servers, and trackers would pinpoint her location instantly. She looked at him with a calmness she didn't feel, and responded with a simple nod. For a few seconds, the lab seemed to hold its breath. Then her finger pressed the Revelation Protocol option, and the screen lit up with a sequence of progress bars. The generator's hum increased, and the emergency lights came on one by one. Alyssa felt a chill run down her spine, a mixture of fear and relief. She was no longer a victim. Now she was living proof of the secret the world couldn't ignore. The transmission began to spread across the satellite network, connecting encrypted channels with international media outlets. Within minutes, the files were replicated on mirror servers, impossible to delete. Scientists' names, contract figures, reports of covert deaths. Everything was being exposed. Gabriel watched the screens. His face hardened. He knew there was no turning back. From outside came the sounds of engines and voices, first distant, then clearer. They had been located. Alyssa took the briefcase with the remaining hard drives and placed it inside a safe, sealing it with her fingerprint. She wasn't trying to save herself, only to ensure the truth outlived her. Alarms began to blare and the power fluctuated. The screen displayed the final message: broadcast complete. In that instant, an eerie calm replaced the panic. Alyssa looked up at Gabriel and they both understood that the ensuing silence would be the loudest noise in the world. The first crash shook the ground. It was a helicopter descending into the clearing. Gabriel turned off the headlights and led them toward a side exit, a tunnel that connected to the woods. Alyssa moved forward behind him, the echo of the engines vibrating in her chest. For the first time since it all began, she wasn't running. out of fear but with purpose. She knew the system had done its job, that the data was out of her control, and that paradoxically set her free. The tunnel smelled of earth and dampness, and as they moved forward, natural light replaced the artificial light. Upon emerging, the trees immediately enveloped them. The barely visible sky flickered with the searchlights. Gabriel took her arm and pointed north, where a narrow path descended to a stream. "They can't track us there by satellite," he said firmly. Alyssa nodded silently, feeling that her breath and the wind were now part of the same pulse. They stopped by the water to catch their breath. Gabriel gazed at the horizon and let out a long sigh, as if he had just unloaded years of invisible weight. He told Alyssa that from that moment on, her name would cease to exist in official records. She had to choose whether to remain hidden or continue the cause from the shadows. She listened in silence, watching the water's reflection flicker between her fingers. It was strange to think that in less than 24 hours, she had gone from being an invisible analyst to a global threat. But deep down, she felt no remorse. Only one certainty: her father would be proud. In the distance, a metallic echo rumbled, a sign that the compound was being raided. Gabriel stood up and said they had to keep walking before reinforcements arrived. The world already knew the truth, but survival remained the unfinished business. As they trudged through the mud, Alyssa noticed Gabriel limping slightly. Looking closer, she saw his sleeve was soaked with blood. He'd been caught during the escape without a word. She tried to stop to help him, but he insisted on continuing, assuring her they could take care of him later. The air smelled of damp earth and gunpowder, a mixture reminiscent of the stories her father told about his youth on military missions. Alyssa felt the family's past catching up with her from all sides, like an inheritance she couldn't reject. The rain intensified, and the forest became a dark and noisy labyrinth. Every step kicked up water and leaves, and sometimes the thunder made her whole body vibrate. Gabriel leaned on her without asking, as if the weight of the truth was crushing him as much as the wound. Despite her fear, Alyssa had no intention of giving up. She understood that her father had left her not just a secret, but a mission. And that mission was no longer about fleeing, but about surviving to keep the truth alive. They arrived at an old, abandoned station in the middle of the woods, its rails overgrown with weeds and its cars rusting. The place seemed forgotten, but on one of the walls was a recent mark, an arrow painted with white chalk. Gabriel recognized it. It was a signal used by former contacts in the program, people who had deserted when they learned what the project had become. They entered a side room where there were blankets, water bottles, and a first aid. Alyssa cleaned Gabriel's wound with what she found, while he tried to stay awake. The silence between them was almost respectful. There was no need for words. Outside, the wind rattled the corrugated iron roof, and with each creak, she thought someone had found them. But no. For the first time in hours, the danger seemed to have passed, and only exhaustion and accumulated tension remained. Alyssa took a deep breath and thought that, even if everything collapsed, her father's message had already served its purpose. Gabriel managed to sleep for a couple of hours, and Alyssa took the opportunity to review the device he had given her. It was an encrypted memory stick with access to the servers where the project files were being replicated. Among the folders, she found something that chilled her to the bone, a record of photographs of her taken since her teenage years in various locations, even inside her own home. Every movement, every change of direction had been monitored for years. The final document had a title in capital letters: Biological Asset Alyssa Rowan, the Priority Level Alpha. She felt a void in her chest, a mixture of indignation and vertigo. She closed the device and put it in her inside jacket pocket. For the first time, she understood that her life had never truly belonged to her, and that now, by exposing the secret, she had finally reclaimed it. Freedom wasn't the absence of danger. It was knowing that Even when pursued, she could no longer be manipulated. As evening fell, Gabriel awoke with a high fever and labored breathing. Alyssa searched the supplies for antibiotics, but most were expired. With no other options, she sat beside him and tried to keep him conscious, talking to him about everyday things, the neighborhood, his favorite coffee shop, the sound of the blinds every morning. It was her way of bringing him back, of reminding him that there was still a world beyond the darkness. Gabriel smiled weakly and whispered that he didn't regret helping her, that his father had been right to trust her. Those words disarmed her. Alyssa felt a lump in her throat, a silent gratitude toward this man who had risked everything to keep a promise. When he closed his eyes, she held his hand for a moment, knowing that even if he didn't wake up again, his sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. Outside, the wind blew softer, as if the forest recognized the stillness of duty fulfilled. Night fell again, and Alyssa lit a small fire with pieces of damp wood. The smoke rose slowly, and the warmth was barely enough to keep her awake. She looked at Gabriel, pale and wrapped in the blanket, and thought that, deep down, they were both products of a system that turned people into tools. The difference was that he had chosen to rebel. The silence was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant call of some nocturnal animal. Alyssa opened her father's notebook and began writing new entries at the end, recording everything that had happened since the previous dawn. She knew that if anyone found this journal, they would have to understand not only the scientific secret, but also the human story behind it. Each word was a form of resistance, a way of bringing meaning back to the chaos. When she finished, she carefully closed the notebook and tucked it inside Gabriel's coat. It was her way of ensuring that the truth would never be completely lost, even if she didn't survive. Hours passed before she heard the sound of engines. In the distance, they weren't helicopters or military vehicles, but ordinary cars. Alyssa extinguished the campfire and peered through a crack in the broken boards of the wall. 3 people were approaching with flashlights, moving cautiously. One of them raised a hand in a gesture of peace and called out her name. She recognized the voice. It was one of her father's former colleagues, a man named Harris, who had disappeared years before. Alyssa hesitated for a few seconds, until the man displayed an old emblem, the same symbol her father had used on security documents. She stepped back cautiously, keeping a safe distance. Harris explained that there were others like her, people who had escaped the program and were now trying to piece together the truth from the outside. For the first time, Alyssa felt she wasn't alone in this fight. Harris and the others helped her move Gabriel to one of the vehicles. His breathing was shallow, but still present. During the drive, they told her that the leaked files had caused a meltdown within several agencies and corporations, and that the media was awash with cross-leaks. The world was beginning to ask questions, though no one yet had complete answers. Alyssa listened silently, watching the night landscape pass by the window. The headlines had turned her into a mysterious figure, a kind of faceless, anonymous whistleblower. But she knew she wasn't seeking fame or immediate justice. She just wanted the truth to live on. Harris drove her to a makeshift shelter on the outskirts of a small coastal town, where other survivors were working on laptops. Everyone there seemed to carry a similar story. Lives erased, false names, secrets tattooed on their souls. Alyssa understood then that her story was just one of many. During the following days, the shelter was filled with constant activity. New data arrived, statements, old records that matched the reports her father had kept. Gabriel, though still weak, managed to wake up and communicate enough to confirm technical details of the program. His military experience helped the others understand the scale of the cover-up. Alyssa worked tirelessly, classifying files and writing summaries that could be used by journalists and international organizations. Sometimes she would stare at the sea through a small window, wondering if her father had ever imagined that all of this would actually come to light. The salty air reminded her of her childhood, when he would take her fishing on Sundays, in those days when life still seemed straightforward. Now each sunrise was a reminder that there is no turning back when you choose the truth. Transparency, she understood, was not a destination. It was a burden that had to be borne day after day. One morning, while reviewing a new batch of files, Alyssa found a hidden audio recording. When she played it, her father's voice filled the room. It was a message that seemed to have been recorded shortly before his death. He spoke calmly, almost as if he knew she would hear him at that moment. "If you're listening to this, it means you managed to do what I couldn't. Don't let them convince you to be silent. Silence is the favorite tool of power," the voice said. Alyssa stood motionless, her hands resting on the table. The words resonated more like a farewell than an instruction. She felt a mixture of pride and profound sadness, because that serene tone was exactly the same as she remembered from her childhood. When the recording ended, she sat for a long time, letting the echo fade. It was as if her father, from some place that no longer belonged to time, was guiding her every decision. That afternoon, she met with Harris and the others to coordinate the release of the final documents. The atmosphere was tense. They knew that the more they exposed, the more dangerous their situation would become. Some suggested halting the dissemination until they found international protection, but Alyssa refused. She said, "There was no greater risk than returning to silence." Her words were firm, and the group looked at her with respect. She was no longer the frightened woman who had woken up that morning, but someone who had understood the price of truth. Harris nodded and activated the security protocols to replicate the information in a decentralized manner. Outside, the sky was becoming covered with thick clouds that foretold a storm. Alyssa gazed at the gray horizon and thought that sometimes storms don't destroy, but cleanse, and that perhaps for the first time the world was ready to see what lay behind the shadows. The storm raged against the windows, and the sound of the wind seemed a constant reminder of everything they had faced. Alyssa tried to sleep, but the images of the last few days kept repeating in her mind like an endless loop. Her father's message, the chase, the choice of protocol. He found it hard to believe that so little time had passed since that early morning when a knock on the door changed his destiny. She looked at her reflection in the fogged glass. She looked like another person, thinner, firmer, more real. On the table, his father's notebook was still open, and a sentence he had written many years before caught his attention. "Courage is not measured by the fear you feel, but by what you do with it." Alyssa ran her fingers over that line as if she could touch it again. She felt a strange calm, a mixture of gratitude and emptiness. Outside, the thunder began to recede, and the shelter, at last, seemed to breathe in silence. When exhaustion overcame her, she understood that peace was not the absence of noise, but being able to sleep knowing that she no longer had to hide. Dawn brought cleaner air, and the shelter, though modest, seemed to have weathered the storm unscathed. Alyssa stepped outside, a blanket draped over her shoulders, watching the sun break through the clouds. The sea was still rough, but there was a new gleam on its surface, as if nature too were celebrating a kind of liberation. Harris approached with a thermos of coffee and told her that the news was reporting mass resignations within the government. Apparently, the leak had triggered a wave of institutional panic that no one could control. Alyssa listened silently, without satisfaction or guilt. She knew that each resignation was the result of ruined lives and hidden truths. Gabriel was still convalescing, but stable, and that gave her a different kind of calm, more human than strategic. The smell of salt and metal still lingered in the air, reminding her how recent it all was. As she sipped the warm coffee, she understood that the truth hadn't saved her from fear, but it had restored her dignity. And in that moment, that was enough. Days passed and the shelter began to transform into a kind of makeshift information center. Statements arrived from journalists, lawyers, and organizations seeking to validate the leaked documents. Alyssa worked late into the night, verifying data and cross-referencing files, aware that every mistake could put lives at risk. She wasn't seeking the limelight, only consistency. The people in the group saw her as a central figure, but she felt simply like someone who had done what was inevitable. Sometimes, when exhaustion overcame her, she would stare at the sea through the small window of her room, trying to remember what it was like to live without fear. The days had a new rhythm, marked by keystrokes, encrypted messages and whispers of hope. The line between public and private blurred more with each sunrise, and although she knew the pursuit could resume at any moment, Alyssa no longer felt like a fugitive. She was, at last, the master of her own story. The impact of the leak began to be felt far beyond the walls of the shelter. International news outlets covered the case cautiously, while experts debated ethics, biotechnology, and human rights. Alyssa watched the headlines with a mixture of disbelief and relief. The world at last was looking in the mirror. However, rumors also circulated of disappearances of journalists and scientists who had tried to speak out. Power was still moving its pieces, only now it was doing so in broad daylight. Harris insisted on keeping the network secure and rotating locations, but Alyssa didn't want to go back into hiding. "There's no going back now," she told him one night, as they watched the flames reflected on the lit screens. Her voice was firm, not defiant, but aware. She understood that transparency could also cost lives, but if she had learned anything, it was that fear only grows when it is fed with silence. As the weeks passed, messages began arriving from people who said they had been part of the program without knowing it. Some told stories of unexplained illnesses, others of missing relatives. Alyssa responded to each one patiently, trying to offer guidance and information for the investigations. What had once been a refuge now resembled a support network. The walls were covered with maps, names, dates, and photographs. Gabriel, now recovered, helped with coordination and security, always with the pragmatic calm of someone who had lived through too many impossible missions. There was a silent respect between them, without promises or unnecessary words. Sometimes, when the tension became unbearable, they shared a coffee in the hallway, gazing at the sea in silence. They didn't need to. They both knew their bond was, forged from survival and truth. And in that understanding, there was a quiet kind of peace. The following weeks tested everyone's resilience. The shelter began receiving anonymous threats, encrypted emails with warnings, and fake locations meant to confuse them. Harris reinforced digital security, but Alyssa knew the real danger came not only from the outside, but from internal exhaustion. There were nights when the volunteers argued, overwhelmed by the pressure and constant fear. She tried to stay calm, reminding them that every line published was one step closer to collective freedom. Gabriel, still frail, served as mediator, reminding them that they had survived worse. That mix of tension and purpose kept the group together, even though no one slept well. Alyssa carried a small wooden cross in her pocket that had belonged to her father. She wasn't religious, but it served as an emotional anchor. Every time she touched it, she felt him there, urging her not to give in. Faith, she thought, doesn't always take the form of belief. Sometimes it's just carrying on when no one else can. One early morning, while reviewing leaked reports from another country, Alyssa noticed a pattern she hadn't seen before. Certain documents were being digitally altered in real time, as if someone were trying to divert attention or confuse sources. She alerted Harris, and together they traced the activity to a compromised government server. The discovery confirmed their suspicions. The very IB agencies they had exposed were now trying to rewrite history before it was recorded for good. This revelation ignited a new urgency within the group. It was no longer just about exposing wrongdoing, but about preserving the memory before it could be manipulated. Alyssa organized shifts for digital surveillance and made physical copies of all the information. She knew that those in power always found ways to camouflage the truth, but also that time could be on their side if they acted quickly. Every file saved was a quiet victory, and in that frantic pace, hope became as essential as air. The dawn of that day arrived bathed in a yellowish light, the kind that often precedes great changes. Alyssa hadn't slept well for 3 nights, checking backups and making sure every piece of data had at least 3 copies on different continents. Gabriel was handling communications, and Harris was talking to a journalist who had promised to publish the full, unfiltered story. The shelter had transformed into a base of resistance, small but unstoppable. Alyssa looked around and saw tired faces, yes, but determined ones. That combination of exhaustion and purpose was the sign that something new was being born. Suddenly, one of the monitors displayed an encrypted message. "The world is listening." No one knew who sent it, but everyone understood its meaning. Alyssa smiled for the first time in weeks, a brief but sincere gesture. Perhaps, she thought, the truth didn't need heroes, but ordinary people who refused to look the other way. That night, the group turned on an old radio that barely picked up a signal, and they listened as different news outlets around the world reported on the Rowan case. They were no longer talking about conspiracies or theories, but about evidence, names, and responsibilities. The rumor had become proof. Some wept, others laughed silently, unsure whether this was a triumph or a condemnation. Gabriel, in a low voice, said that all that remained was to endure the consequences. Alyssa didn't reply. She just watched the flame flicker in a candle on the table. She understood that revealing the truth wasn't the end, but the beginning of another battle, the battle to keep it alive. Those in power would try to discredit it, invent versions, erase what they had achieved. But as long as there was someone willing to remember, the secret could not be buried again. And that night, amidst the static, Alyssa felt freer than ever. The following days were a whirlwind of news, leaks, and official reactions. Entire governments were thrown into crisis. Commissions of inquiry were formed, and even the most skeptical media outlets had to acknowledge the magnitude of the case. Alyssa's name still didn't appear publicly, but her story spread like a recognizable shadow among those who knew how to read between the lines. Some called her the Invisible Woman, others simply the Source. Alyssa observed everything from a distance, not feeling like a protagonist in any of it, just another piece in a puzzle that had taken decades to assemble. Every time she saw a news report, she thought of her father and how he would have reacted to seeing that his legacy had finally fulfilled its purpose. The world wasn't safer, but it was a little more aware. That was the only possible victory. And although she continued to live cautiously, she no longer felt fear for tomorrow. Instead, she felt a quiet kind of pride that needed no witnesses. One gray afternoon, Alyssa and Gabriel walked along the coast far from the shelter. The air had that salty, electric smell of the days before a storm. They had spent so much time running that moving without looking back felt almost unnatural. He asked her if she had ever thought about starting over with another name in another place. She replied that she didn't want to hide behind a false identity again. "I prefer to live being who I am, even if no one remembers," she said calmly. Gabriel nodded and threw a stone into the sea. The splash sounded like a necessary closure, a kind of silent farewell to the past. They walked for a while without speaking, letting the wind act as translator between their thoughts. Alyssa understood then that silence, when not imposed, can also be freedom. That night, back at the shelter, they found the group gathered in front of a live broadcast. A presenter was speaking of new revelations. Experiments had been confirmed in several countries, with specific names and locations. The evidence was irrefutable. Harris's face was illuminated by the screen, and his moist eyes reflected relief. For the first time, the truth wasn't in his hands. It belonged to the world. Alyssa felt an enormous weight lift from her chest, a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. All the fear, the sleepless nights, the losses, seemed to converge in that instant. Her father's sacrifice had not been in vain. Gabriel placed a hand on her shoulder, and she didn't move. It was a small gesture, but it contained more gratitude than 1,000 words. The group decided to disperse after that night. They had accomplished their primary mission, and now each had to find their own way forward. Some planned to return to their families. Others, like Harris, would continue collaborating from new locations. Alyssa and Gabriel agreed to stay a few more days, making sure to destroy anything that could incriminate them. As they burned old documents in a barrel, sparks flew into the sky, as if carrying invisible messages. The fire crackled with a hypnotic sound, and Alyssa remembered the first time she had seen something burn, the candle on her father's table when she was a child. There was something poetic, though she avoided thinking in those terms, about the end of that story also being written in fire. The wind blew hard, but it couldn't extinguish the flames, and when the last piece of paper was consumed, she knew she was also saying goodbye to her old self. When the shelter was empty, the silence took on a new form. It was no longer a threat, but a respite. Alyssa packed a small backpack with the essentials and placed her father's notebook inside. Gabriel watched her from the doorway, leaning against the frame, with the expression of someone who has seen too much to fear anything more. He asked her where she was going, and she smiled slightly before answering, "Anywhere the truth still makes sense." She didn't need a destination, just movement. He offered to walk with her, but Alyssa shook her head. She knew that each of them had to follow their own path, and his couldn't be tied to hers. They embraced without words, a brief but sincere gesture. Afterward, she cast one last look at the shelter, at the walls that had witnessed her rebirth, and with a determined step she walked away along the path that led to the cliff, leaving behind all that had once been fear. Dawn found her walking alone along the shore, the wind whipping her hair and the constant murmur of the waves her only accompaniment. Each step was confirmation that she was still alive, and that living, in her case, was a political act. She took the notebook from her pocket and opened it to the last page written by her father. Beneath his handwriting, she added a new line: "Silence is most powerful when it chooses to speak." Then she closed the notebook and held it to her chest, as if she could hear the echo of an ancient heartbeat. The sea shimmered with a golden, almost transparent light. Alyssa looked up and for the first time in a long time breathed without fear. The air tasted of endings, but also of beginnings. And although the world remained uncertain, she knew she had done her part. The truth, she thought, was no longer her burden. It was her inheritance. The following months passed with a calm that felt almost unreal. Alyssa settled in a small coastal town under a different name, but without completely hiding. She worked assisting organizations that investigated corporate crimes and provided anonymous advice to journalists seeking to understand the leaked files. There was no glamour or recognition, only purpose. Every so often she received encrypted emails from Harris informing her that the case was expanding, that each new document revealed another layer of the cover-up. Gabriel, according to those messages, had decided to return abroad to work on humanitarian missions. Alyssa smiled when she read them. She knew that man couldn't live any other way. Her current life was simple: sunrises by the sea, quiet afternoons working, and nights when the memory of her father came without pain. Fear had stopped haunting her. Now she was only accompanied by the clear conscience of having done the right thing. And that, in a world like hers, was already a form of victory. If you've also reached this point, take a moment to consider what truth means in your own life. Sometimes it's not about conspiracies or secrets, but about having the courage to face what hurts. Tell me where you're coming from with this story, and if you've ever felt that telling the truth changed anything for you. Your message can empower someone else who remains silent today. Alyssa, meanwhile, approached the cliff in the late afternoon and watched the sun sink below the horizon. The sea roared calmly, a reminder of all that survives even when no one speaks its name. She closed her eyes and, for the first time, didn't think about running away or hiding. She simply breathed, certain that the story was no longer hers alone, but belonged to all those who still dare to listen. That night, the town was enveloped in a serene silence, broken only by the sound of the sea gently lapping against the rocks. Alyssa turned on a lamp on the small table in her house and reviewed the latest reports from the journalists she collaborated with. The headlines spoke of trials, confessions, and political resignations. None of it filled her with euphoria, only a sense of closure, like when a wound finally heals. She set her laptop aside and opened a new notebook. On the first page, she wrote, "What we inherit isn't always material possessions. Sometimes it's truths that must be told." That sentence sounded more like a promise than a reflection. Outside, the moon illuminated the horizon, and for a moment, Alyssa imagined her father watching her from there. There was no more guilt or pain, only a silent connection with the man who taught her that the truth, though delayed, always finds its way. And in that thought, she found something she hadn't expected: peace. The next day, Alyssa walked to the pier, her father's notebook in hand. The sky was clear, and a gentle breeze stirred the flags of the anchored boats. She sat on the edge of the gangplank and opened the notebook. She read a couple of pages and smiled. The words still held power, even after everything. Then she tore out a sheet, folded it carefully, and released it into the sea. The paper floated for a few seconds before slowly sinking, taking with it a part of everything she had lived through. Alyssa watched it disappear, feeling that this gesture was a symbolic farewell, a goodbye that no longer hurt. The water splashed her lightly, and that cold drop on her face brought her back to the present. She walked home slowly, the sun at her back, certain that even though the world kept changing, she no longer needed to run from her past. She had faced it, told her story, and above all, survived it. A few more months passed, and the story began to fade from the media, replaced by new crises and headlines. Alyssa knew that's how the world worked. The urgent displaced the important. But it didn't bother her. The essential work was done. Every now and then she received messages from people who had read excerpts from the files and said they felt less alone. Those messages were her true recognition. In the village, people knew her only as the quiet woman who drank coffee by the sea every morning. No one imagined that she had defied the greatest power in the country, and she liked that. Anonymity was, at last, a chosen refuge. Sometimes she wondered what would have become of her life if she had ignored that knock on the door that morning. But when she looked at the horizon, she understood that, although it had all begun with fear, it had ended with purpose. One afternoon, while organizing some old papers, Alyssa found the metal card Gabriel had given her at the beginning of their escape. She held it for a few seconds, remembering every moment they had shared: the escape, the forest, the sleepless nights, the impossible decisions. She didn't know if she would ever see him again, but she understood that her journey had been necessary. She decided to bury it by the cliff, under a smooth rock where the sea crashed against the shore. This gesture, she thought, was her way of closing the circle. She didn't need material proof of what had happened. Memory was enough. As the sand covered the metal, she felt a mixture of relief and melancholy. She didn't cry. She just took a deep breath, letting the wind tousle her hair. In the distance, the sun was beginning to sink below the horizon, painting the sky a deep orange. It was the same color as the sunrise she had seen after revealing the truth. The same color that, without her knowing it, had given her back her life. That night, Alyssa lit a candle on the dining room table and placed beside it an old photograph of her father, the same one she had rescued from the shelter. His serene face, with that restrained smile, seemed to gaze at her across time. He spoke to her in a low voice, thanking her for not giving up, for leaving the clues that guided her entire path. It was strange, she thought, how true love sometimes manifests itself as a warning. Outside, the wind blew with the same rhythm as on those nights when he used to tell her stories of justice and duty. For the first time, those words didn't sound idealistic but possible. She blew out the candle and let the smoke rise, forming a spiral that vanished into thin air. She realized she no longer needed answers. The past had found its place, and with it, her own inner peace. Alyssa smiled faintly, aware that her silence now also told a story. The next day, the sea was calm, almost motionless. Alyssa got up early and walked barefoot on the damp sand, enjoying the cool texture beneath her feet. The sky was clear, and the air smelled of salt and freedom. She sat on a rock and stayed there for a long time, gazing unhurriedly at the horizon. For the first time, she didn't think about the past or the future, but simply about being alive. The waves broke gently, and each one seemed to tell her that the world kept turning, that life always found a way to be reborn. She closed her eyes and let the wind envelop her. It was a different kind of silence, not the kind that frightens, but the kind that heals. When she opened them, she smiled serenely. She had survived the darkness, and now the light no longer frightened her. As the days passed, Alyssa's routine became predictable, almost therapeutic. She would wake early, walk along the shore, and then spend hours writing in a new notebook, trying to put into words everything she had experienced. Not to publish anything, but to remind herself that true stories don't need witnesses to be valid. Each page was a conversation with herself, a way to reconcile her past with the peaceful present she had conquered. Sometimes the ringing of the phone would stop her, but she almost never answered. Not out of fear, but because she had learned that not all answers deserve to be heard. She lived with little, ate simply, and had found in solitude a kind of painless companionship. Alyssa understood that the world might forget her name, but not what she had unleashed. The truth, though distorted by time, always finds a crack through which to seep. And as the sea continued to repeat its eternal language, she understood that, in the end, she had gained something no one could take from her, her own voice. That night, the sky lit up with stars, clear and bright as she hadn't seen them in a long time. Alyssa sat on the sand and gazed at the horizon, where the sea and the darkness merged seamlessly. She thought about all that had been lost and all that remained, and understood that survival is also a form of love. She took a small piece of paper from her pocket, her father's last note, and let it fly on the wind. The scrap drifted away, twirling, reflecting the moonlight for a moment before disappearing. She smiled, knowing there was no perfect ending, only continuity. Tomorrow the sea would return, the wind would return, and perhaps someone somewhere would remember her story or learn from it. And if not, it didn't matter. Silence would no longer be an imposition, but a choice. Alyssa closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let the night embrace her. For the first time in years, she felt neither fear nor anger nor doubt, only peace.